So for our first problem scenario, we've got a few different documents here. We've got an email, we've got a directive, and we've got a piece of Irish legislation here as well. And you might be thinking, what on earth am I supposed to do with these? Well, the starting point is to read through the email. I'd start at the bottom email that explains the background of the situation. In essence, you have a business person who wants to rely upon a right derived from an EU law, in this case a directive, but he's been told by the broadcasting company, Virginia Media, that he is not entitled to what he thinks he's entitled to under this directive. And his concern is that the Irish piece of legislation that seeks to implement the directive doesn't seem to grant him the right he thinks he's entitled to under this directive. So there are 3 steps whenever someone wants to rely on, in particular, a directive such as this. You'll remember this from our lecture. It's direct effect, indirect effect, and state liability. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is this a type of legal act that can be relied upon by your client who is a private party or a private business? So what type of measure is this? What type of direct effect does it have? Well, we know it's a directive. It says the word directive at the top. So what kind of legal effect does a directive have? I'll give you a clue right away. You may remember directives have direct effect vertically only. What does that mean? And crucially, what does Virginia Media have to be in order for your client to rely upon the directive against them? So that's the first step. So think about your case law, think about your key cases on direct effect. Crucially, think about the criteria that has to be fulfilled from one of those cases as to whether or not this type of measure can be relied upon against Virginia Media. If you cannot demonstrate direct effect, parties may be able to rely upon indirect effect. Now, indirect effect, you'll recall, is an obligation to interpret national law wherever possible in accordance with EU law. And that's why you've been given both the national law and the EU law. So look for the right within the directive that your client wants to rely upon. Then look at the national law and ask yourself, can this be interpreted in accordance with this? Again, think about the case law, think about the circumstances in which indirect effect can operate, and ask yourself the question, can this be interpreted in such a way as to conform with the directive? Bearing in mind the limitations that are placed upon indirect effect. Finally, take a look at state liability. Can your client sue the Irish government for failing to properly implement this directive in Irish law? So for this, you need to look for your key case, set out your criteria, and then consider whether or not that criteria applies in this case. It's a simple 3 steps: direct effect, indirect effect, and state liability.